Do you want to dominate Elden Ring and punish your enemies with heavy explosions, satisfying knockbacks, and stance breaks? This build will allow you to do all of this while maintaining a solid and fluid gameplay. I had no idea how fun the ancient Meteoric or Greatsword can be, and I think you will have a lot of fun too. I am the Samurai and I will be guiding you on how to maximize the ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, state the possible challenges that this weapon has, and help you overcome them. So ultimately, it will help you decide if you want to try this build, and if you are looking for the best build for the ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, this video is for you. The Spark Crusader is from a legion of knights outside of the fog, and soon enter the lands between to dominate and take the Elden throne. This individual has incomparable battle experience and is equipped with an ancient weapon that only this individual can wield. The Spark Crusader heavily relies on the ancient Meteoric Greatsword to deal the majority of its damage with hard-hitting sword swings and special attacks. The build that can not only deal great burst damage but also succeeds in frequent knockback attacks and stance breaks. This Crusader focuses on strength and arcane for its main stats and uses incantations to deal the majority of its range attacks to adapt in various situations. The build playstyle is out of the way, moving on to the Spark Crusader's stats. Starting with Vigor first, and I allocated 50 points to Vigor since it is likely that a user will be getting hit while performing the weapon's unique skill animation as it is a multi-hitting skill. Next is Mind and 26 points were allocated to it. 26 points is more than enough for us to perform optimally in this build, and all of our damage sources in this build are FP efficient, so having 26 points is enough. Endurance is next, and I have allotted 35 points for Endurance, and it will give you ample amount of stamina to work with. Strength and Arcane are going to be our main offensive stats in this build, allocating 80 points to Strength and 43 to Arcane for us to have a good attack rating for our main weapon later on. Lastly, no points were added to Intelligence and Dexterity. On the other hand, I'm also receiving a lot of comments about what a level 150 stat spreads will look like for my builds, so I will include them starting from now. Stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Spark Crusader's equipment. Starting with the build's main weapon, which is the mentioned ancient Meteoric or Greatsword. A colossal type of weapon that requires 20 strength and 10 dexterity for a user to wield the weapon properly, while having B scaling for strength, in E for dexterity, and lastly D for arcane. Its damage is a combination of physical with a little bit of magic damage. Moving on to the ancient Meteoric or its unique skill, which is the White Light Charge, a very satisfying skill to use that not only deals huge damage but can also stance break enemies often. The majority of enemies in this game, especially humanoid type of enemies, are going to be powerless against this skill as the frequent knockbacks make fights trivial, while bigger targets or bosses will be stance broken, allowing the user to deal more damage. Pressing L2 will let the user perform a gap closing thrust attacks which deals good damage on its own. However, pressing L2 again will let the user perform a violent thrust explosion, which is the main damage dealing tool in this build. Moving on to the build's secondary weapon, and I am using the Dragon Communion Seal to cast our key buffs and also for us to equip our offensive incantations later on. Weapons are out of the way, let's move on to spells. And the first one on the list is of course our Flame Grant Me Strength incantation for an additional 20% physical damage attack boost and stamina recovery buff. The second buff on the list is of course Golden Vow. This buff increases overall damage by 15% and adds 10% damage negation, which is very helpful for this build. For our offensive incantation, I decided to focus on the weapon skill for this build when dealing the majority of the damage. However, for versatility purposes, I decided to slot in Lightning Spear for your range attack needs. It will be hitting less in this build as it is not the focus of this build. Equipping the Lightning Spear matches the build's theme, but if you don't care about the overall theme of this build, and if you wish to add more arcane-based incantation later on, that is a viable option as well. But before anything else, only 6% of you who watch the channel regularly are subscribed, so help the channel by subscribing today, and it's free anyway, and I will thank you forever. If you can hit that like button as well, it will surely help me a lot. Spells are out of the way, moving on to my suggested talismans for this build. The first talisman on the list is our staple Shard of Alexander. This provides a 15% skill damage increase and it will make our White Light Charge skill stronger. Next is, I suggest slotting in two-handed sword Talisman. In this setup, you will be dealing huge numbers by just performing normal attacks, and since this is a colossal weapon, every attack will hit like an absolute freight train, and the two-handed sword Talisman will further increase your damage since we'll be two-handing this sword a lot. For the third talisman in this build, I suggest slotting in two-headed turtle Talisman for more stamina regeneration in general. The more stamina you have, the more action you can perform in combat. The last slot in this build is kind of flexible, but for starters, Dragon Crest Great Shield is suggested since the weapon skill will have this long wind-up time and the chances of you getting hit will be high, especially if you are adjusting to the build's playstyle. But if you don't need protection and find yourself doing jump attacks, slotting in Claw Talisman will be beneficial for this build. Now moving on to Great Runes, and as always, I suggest slotting in Godric's Great Rune for the additional 5 stats across the board. Now the main equipment is out of the way, let's move on to the Spark Crusader's armor set. I'm going for this strong Dark Knight theme while matching the ancient Meteoric Or's Greatsword's looks. I'm wearing the Black Knight's helm, Malekith's armor, and gauntlets, and lastly the Death Knight's greaves. If you don't care about the looks and you want to optimize your damage further, wearing Rakshasa set to have an additional 8% damage across the board. Moving on to my Flash of Wonders physique combination, slotting in Stormbarb Crack Tier is a no-brainer for this build. Pair it with Green Burst Crystal Tier for more stamina regeneration bonus. Equipment and spells are out of the way, it's time for the build's pros and cons. Starting with pros first. The first pro that I can think of is of course its great damage output. The thrust attack will only deal moderate to great damage overall, but the finisher is the meat of this build. Every successful finisher that you will manage to get through will take away significant portion of the target's health. Another huge pro in this setup is great stance damage. As mentioned, majority of the enemies in the game will be powerless against this weapon, especially if you are on the landscape. Humanoid type enemies or bosses can be taken advantage of after getting knocked back. What I usually do is punish them with a weapon skill or a follow-up jump attack while they are down, as they can't react to it and just soak in the damage. Not to mention, your attacks will also deal great stance damage since this is a colossal weapon. On that note, this is a colossal weapon. However, because of its weapon unique skill, it allows the user to move gracefully in combat. What I usually do is perform the skill if I want to counter enemies in an instant, since the thrust attack as mentioned can be a gap closing tool. If I'm dealing with fast moving targets, I don't usually perform the finisher unless I'm absolutely sure that I'm not gonna get hit, but instead use the gap closing thrust to close into targets. The last advantage that I can think of for this build is its focus points efficiency. You will be relying on the weapon skill a lot, and in my experience, since I am using the skill wisely, flasking was not too frequent when using this build. Of course, like any other build, the Spark Crusader has its downside as well. The first one is of course, when dealing with fast moving targets, pulling off the finisher can be a challenging task. You'll be relying on the skill's thrust attacks when gap closing to enemies, or pulling off normal attack combos or jump attacks. The next one that I can think of is not everyone can easily adjust using this weapon. There are a lot of players who don't prefer the slow moving gameplay of colossal weapons in general. You will be committed in every attack that you will perform, so calculating openings will be a constant thing when using this build. But as I have mentioned, this colossal weapon is somehow an exception because of its great mobility in combat. Overall, the Spark Crusader is an engaging and fun build to play. Punishing enemies with its massive damage dealing normal attacks and devastating explosion will appeal to many players out there. Strength build lovers will find this weapon great as it gives the user mobility in combat despite of the weapon's class. Comment down below which weapon would you like me to do next, and if you have made it this far, I just want to say that I do appreciate you. Join our Discord server as we are building an empire. You can find like-minded players, and I also post all of my latest updates over there. As always, give this video a like as it helps me a lot, and make sure to subscribe as more builds coming soon. Now, if you want to play as an Iron Berserker or learn how to build the strongest build in Elden Ring, these build videos are for you. And I will catch you on the next one.